So in this video, I'm picking up back in my code and I'm using my code from last week's assignment. I've saved out a new version. I'm going to adapt this to accommodate the two images that I've sketched out in Illustrator. And so my first step here is to create two graphics variables, and I'll save the image of myself as a living person in one and the image of myself as a skeleton in the other. So this is some content that was covered in the Create Graphics demo video for this week's micro lectures. So here I am setting that up in the code, creating the images the right size, and then just transferring over all the shapes that I'd drawn from last week's assignment into the graphics layer for those elements. And I'll do the same thing with the skeleton layer. Now, while I'm doing this, I'm jumping back and forth to the reference and making sure that I know the correct way to adjust the transparency of those two graphics variables. And I ended up settling on using the tint function, and that's a nice, easy way to adjust how transparent each one is, and that way I can set some interaction to be able to jump back and forth between the two images. So I'll basically have them overlaid right on top of each other, just like I had in Illustrator, and attach some interactions to them so that based on how someone's touching the screen, I'll get different levels of transparency for one image over top the other. So now you can see I'm doing the same exact process with my skeleton layer. So really the main difference between these two sets of steps in code, I'm sort of funneling all of the shapes that go to make the living version of my portrait into one graphics variable, and all of the shapes that are making the skeleton version into another graphics variable. So that way I have these sort of two layers in code, and that makes it really easy to swap back and forth between the two or to overlay both right on top of one another. Like a lot of things in code, there's never just one completely correct way to do this. So the advantage to the approach that I'm taking here is it's very straightforward. It's a lot of coding. I can see I'm writing lots and lots of lines. At this point in the video, I'm making that shirt shape, which is, along with the skull, probably the most complex shape. So it's a little tedious. The disadvantage to doing it this way is that my draw block in the code is going to be really long. So there's going to be lots of code in it. So I need to make sure that I'm keeping all of my code text organized, that I'm writing in comments that are notes for myself to describe what each part of the code is doing. And that'll just make it a lot easier to work through and make sure that I have a consistent understanding of what my code is at least trying to do. So you can see here I'm mapping out that skull shape with a Bezier curve function and the begin shape and end shape. Other stuff like the eyes are just simpler, more primitive shapes. So just bringing over all the styling info from Illustrator into my code. And other than using the graphics variables and the create graphics function, so far we're pretty consistent with the coding techniques that we've used this week and last week. And in the next couple videos that will show my process here, we'll get into some more of the actual interaction and making things change, making things respond to someone who's actually touching the screen or doing something with the sketch. This was actually a pretty fun challenge for me, sort of seeing if I could get this sketch to do the things that I wanted to do without making the code too complicated. So I'm making sure to try to rely on just the things that we've covered in the first and second week of micro lectures. So like I mentioned earlier, there might be more efficient ways to code what I'm coding here, but they're going to be more abstract and more advanced. So we might come back around to this and touch on some of those, but for now, this should work pretty well. And we're about ready to get some interaction between those two graphics layers.